So, this is a ZIL. It says it right here, ZIL. Looks a bit funny because it's in foreign. The ZIL automotive plant was a huge factory located in Moscow in what was then the heart of the Soviet Union. They were known for two things, making giant limousines for the political elite and trucks. This, of course, is a truck. This particular model is a ZIL 131, and for my money, is the perfect general purpose military vehicle. When I acquired this, I already owned an example of the British Army version, the Bedford MK. So this is me back in the year 2000, and this is how it was in service with this standard canvas tilt frame on the back. I eventually changed that for a command body and even lived in it for a couple of years. Fond as I am of the Bedfords, this thing is just in a different league. And it's mainly down to it being a purpose-designed military vehicle, designed and built just for this role. Compared to Western military vehicles of the time, the specs on this thing are amazing. I mean, just like power steering for a start. My Bedford was a much younger truck than this and still had manual steering. We've got 6-wheel drive at the flick of a switch. Of course, the Bedford only has 4-wheel drive. We have central tyre inflation. So there's a lever in the cab that controls the tyre pressure, and you can lower the pressure in all the tyres at once, say if you wanted to cross some boggy ground. And then you can pump them up again when you hit the road, all without even stopping. This thing left the factory with a 6-litre V8 petrol engine. Why petrol? Well, it was intended to be able to work at plus 50 degrees and minus 50 degrees Celsius without modification. And at those low temperatures, diesel would just freeze solid. It was also multi-fuel to an extent, so the engine would run on very low-grade petrol or even a petrol-diesel mix. The engine was also, in some respects, a massive liability, but we'll get to that later. I have done a couple of long-distance trips in this, and it's actually a lovely thing to drive. With the power steering, decent suspension, the cab's a really nice place to be as well. You've got a fearsome heater, and on particularly cold nights, you can fill up this hot water bottle from a little tap that's under the dash here, and have low-tech heated seats. Everything is massively built, nothing is skimped on. Here in the UK, we did once have comparable purpose-built vehicles. Back in the 50s, we had the Austin Champ as a light vehicle, and the Leyland Martian, which saw use as a recovery vehicle and a general purpose heavy truck. But as the British Empire shrank, and so did the MOD budgets, the military in this country turned to using vehicles that were just slightly more rugged versions of the civilian ones. So the Champ gave way to the simpler and much cheaper Land Rover, and the Bedford MK you saw earlier, that's just a slightly more rugged version of the civilian TK with added 4-wheel drive. The Soviets, meanwhile, carried on with a policy of building pure military vehicles, and in vast numbers too. This model alone, by the end of its production run, clocked up over 1 million units. Whether it did them any good or not is highly debatable. The Soviet Union spent an enormous proportion of their income on military expenditure, and in that one regard, they were world leaders. But the consequence was that in everything else, the lives of the people, the economy in general, all suffered. This truck was built in 1975 and it left the factory as you see it here, a chassis cab. Of course they all did. They were then fitted out for their intended role. So usually that meant putting a flatbed on there and a canvas tilt, but also all kinds of other body types. So like fire trucks. Some of them were even fitted with a powered trailer and a whacking great missile on the back. This one was fitted with a big water tank, a pump powered by the engine, and lockers full of hoses and pressure washing gear. It was a nuclear decontamination vehicle. Once fitted out, it travelled across Russia and then across the countries of the Warsaw Pact to arrive in East Germany. And I think it did that under its own steam, and I'll explain why in a moment. Once it got to the divided country of Germany, it took its place on what was then the front line of the Cold War. Now here in the West, and certainly my perception growing up in the 1980s, nuclear war was considered an extinction level event. The Soviets, however, believed that in the event of the Cold War turning hot, a limited nuclear exchange was possible, and if so, a conventional ground war would follow. That scenario is why the Soviets had thousands and thousands of tanks in Germany lined up and ready to go. That scenario is what this truck was built for, kitted out with all that pressure washing gear to wash the fallouts from tanks so they could be sent into battle. For 10 years this truck was primed and ready. It had an annual service, and then judging by the mileage on it, it was just driven around the block and parked up again. After 10 years, so mid-80s now, for whatever reason that annual service stopped. It seemed like this truck and all its brethren, for there were many of these, were deemed no longer necessary, and so it was just taken out of service and put into long-term storage somewhere. All this I gleaned from a big wad of documents that I found in the cab. After decades of fear and paranoia, the end of the Cold War came rather abruptly. The Berlin Wall fell, Germany reunited, the Soviet Union, that massive empire, collapsed in on itself and disappeared virtually overnight. And so this, and thousands of other bits of military hardware like it, were left orphaned. So what do you do with an entire fleet of low-mileage nuclear decontamination vehicles? Well, one chap here in the UK thought he had the answer, and he got about 100 or so of these and had them shipped to an airfield in Norfolk. The story I heard was that he planned to sell them on to aid agencies in Africa to use as water tankers. The trouble is, the agencies didn't want them. Perhaps because of the V8 petrol engine and its fearsome fuel consumption. Perhaps because the collapse of the Soviet Union meant no more serviceable parts of these things. Perhaps just because it was overkill for its intended role. I mean, it's an awful lot of truck for the size of the tank that was on it, compared to a purpose-built water tanker. Whatever the reason, that guy went bust and lost the lot. Now, I never met him myself, but I was told this story by someone in a nearby business as I was standing in his yard, looking at about 20 of these that he bought from his bankrupt neighbour. I wasn't even there looking to buy a truck. I'd just gone there because a mate of mine had heard about these 20 Soviet vehicles lined up in the yard and wanted to go and have a look, so we'd just gone as a jolly day out. Now apparently, chatting to the guy who had these, there'd been loads of interest in them, but no one was buying them. By this point, none of them had run for at least 25 years, so they're all looking pretty ropey and with bits missing. Kind of like it does now. Despite having no intention to buy anything prior to turning up, I've always had a bit of a weakness for a bargain, and this guy was very keen to sell on all these trucks that were clogging up his yard. So we shook hands on a deal that included delivery down to Sussex, where I was living at the time, and I got this for 600 quid. Basically scrap value. So my mate and I, we went round the yard, we picked the least ropey looking truck, wrote my name on it. I remember we gave the guy all the cash that we had on us as a deposit, which was £37 and some loose change. A week later, a massive lorry turned up with this lorry on the back of it. I handed over the balance of the money and the ZIL was mine. I remember noticing when it was delivered that the front springs here had been greased and wrapped up in brown paper. That's how new old stock this truck was. When I first found the ZIL, it had about 1,500 kilometres on the clock. And that's why I think it made it from the factory down to Germany and then never did much after that. Despite the decades of neglect, the truck was, well, and is, in surprisingly good condition. There's no structural rust on anything vital. Well, I do remember the exhaust, that had terminal rust and exploded all over the yard the first time I started the engine. Just like all its previous owners, I had no actual use for a nuclear decontamination vehicle. So I got rid of that big water tank, got rid of the PTO pump, all the other gear. I ended up fitting a big high-up crane to it, a big timber grab. I even made it road legal. And it was even kind of useful for a bit, but mostly I just liked having it around because it looked cool. In time I got rid of the crane. I swapped that for a whole load of telegraph poles and I used them to build my house. And then a few years later I used the remainder of the poles to build my workshop. I did miss the crane, it was very useful, but then again, so is my house and workshop. At some point, and perhaps even before I took the crane off, the starter motor for that big V8 fell to pieces. And although I could crank it into life with a starting handle, I needed a bloody good reason to do so. And the upshot was that the usage got less and the periods between times of usage got longer, and it ended up just, well, mostly sitting in the brambles. And so after a while, and not for the first time in its existence, the ZIL became a vehicle neglected, abandoned, almost forgotten. That is until one slightly drunken night, my mate Mark and I came up with a fantastic idea of building a mobile pipe organ. And of course we needed an eye-catching vehicle to build it onto, and thus the idea for Project Awesome was born. Shockingly, that moment was over 7 years ago. Now, we did do lots of work, we did make lots of progress. I think the main achievement on the truck was getting rid of that terrible, brilliant but terrible V8 petrol engine and installing the 6-cylinder Cummins 6PT, which is a far superior choice of engine for our needs. But after all that time, we still don't have a complete pipe organ and we still don't have a roadworthy vehicle to put it on. Now, in my defence, 3 of those 7 years were spent working on Kermit. That was my main project. And everything else was kind of put on hold. But that's done now. The Land Rover's up together, and so my full attention can return to this project. Project Awesome is very much a team effort. The trouble is the other half of the team is a very busy man these days. So Mark will be along. We just have to wait for him to find some time in between his other jobs. In the meantime, although I'm not going to do any organ building on my own, I can at least make a start on the old truck. So the first job, and perhaps in tribute to its original function, is to pressure wash this thing. Not to remove fallout, but to remove years of grime, moss, rust, flaky paint, etc. Well, there's one sign of progress, and that's... it does at least start in the key now. It still looks ropey, but at least it's clean. I do have all the missing bits. Got headlight guard, one on each side there. I've got the grille, that's actually already been blasted. This is the side panel that goes there. It used to say K2. Oh, it did when it was dropped off in my yard a long time ago. I got my clipboard out. I'm going to go around the truck and make a list of all the jobs that need sorting. Well, all the obvious jobs. A starting list, put it that way. Then I'll put the list in some kind of order, pick the top one, and next time around we'll get stuck into that. I'll see you for that. Cheers for now.